There's a strange kind of peace that settles over you when you move out to the edge of town. The kind of peace you don't really appreciate until someone tries to take it from you. My wife and I had chosen this place deliberately, tucked, away in a wooded subdivision, close enough to civilization that we weren't cut off, but far enough that we could hear the crickets at night instead of car horns. The house was simple, a ranch style with a wide porch, an acre and a half of land, and a workshop out back where I kept most of my tools. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. And after decades of working, saving, and planning, it felt like we had finally carved out a corner of the world that belonged to us. But if you've ever dealt with a homeowners association, you already know that peace is always conditional. You're not really free. You're under watch. The rules that first sound like they're meant to keep order, lawn height limits, paint color approvals, driveway regulations, start to feel less like guidelines and more like shackles. And once you run into the wrong people on the board, those shackles tighten fast. For us, trouble didn't start with a broken rule. It started with jealousy. My wife, Jenna, is one of those people who naturally lights up a neighborhood. She's the kind who bakes pies for block parties, remembers kids' birthdays, and checks on neighbors when she notices their lights haven't been on for a while. She's got that warmth about her, and people gravitate toward it, which, apparently, made her a target. The HOA board president, a man named Clifford, though everyone just called him Cliff, didn't like not being the center of attention. He was the kind of guy who wore polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, as if he were running a Fortune 500 company instead of a volunteer board. He had this puffed-up confidence about him, like being in charge of a neighborhood made him more important than he really was. And he especially didn't like when Jenna started organizing a small gardening club with some of the other wives in the subdivision. It was harmless, really. Just a few women trading tips on tomatoes and swapping flower seeds. But Cliff saw it as a threat. I noticed it the first time he cornered her at the mailbox. I was watching from the workshop, wiping the grease off my hands after tuning the lawnmower, when I saw his stance, too close, too rigid. Jenna kept smiling politely, but I could see the tightness in her shoulders. Later, when I asked what he'd wanted, she brushed it off. "He just thinks we should have cleared the garden club through the board," she said. "Nothing big." But Cliff didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, the HOA started sending us little violation notices, ridiculous ones. One said the trim around our windows was not in harmony with the neighborhood palette, even though it was the same shade of cream as the house across the street. Another said our mailbox was leaning at a hazardous angle. I checked. It with a level. It was off by less than a degree. We both knew what was happening. Cliff wanted to make an example of us. He didn't like that Jenna had something in the neighborhood that wasn't under his control, and he was going to squeeze us until we either submitted or broke. Now, normally, I'm not the type to take neighborhood politics seriously. I've spent most of my life in tougher environments, places where intimidation actually had teeth. I served in the Air Force, working on logistics and later on infrastructure projects overseas. I've dealt with real threats, people who weren't just playing at power, but living it, breathing it. So watching Cliff puff himself up like some kind of tyrant always struck me as almost pathetic. But when his game started creeping into my wife's peace of mind, when Jenna started looking over her shoulder every time she went to water the plants, that's when I began paying closer attention. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I'd run into town to pick up lumber, planning to fix a section of the back fence that had started to sag. Jenna stayed home, busy with her herbs on the back porch. By the time I got back, I noticed something strange. Her car door was wide open, the gardening tools spilled across the driveway. I dropped the lumber and jogged up to the house. She was inside, pale and shaken, clutching her phone like she'd just hung up from dialing 911. "They sent people," she whispered. I frowned. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "Bikers. 2 of them. They pulled up on their Harleys, right here in our driveway. Leather jackets, patches, the whole thing. They said they were friends of the board, and that maybe I should stop trying to stir up trouble with the garden club. They laughed about how accidents happen when people don't follow the rules. I felt something in me go still. Not angry. Not yet. Just still the way you get when the air pressure drops before a storm. I made her sit down, got her a glass of water, and asked every detail. She told me their appearance, the sound of their engines, even the way one of them smelled faintly of gasoline when he leaned too close. That was when I knew Cliff had crossed a line. Sending notices was one thing. Harassing us at the mailbox was another. But dragging in outsiders, muscle, to intimidate my wife? That wasn't just HOA politics anymore. That was personal. I stepped out onto the porch and stared down the quiet cul-de-sac. The sun was setting, streaks of orange burning through the trees, and the neighborhood looked so deceptively peaceful. But I could still hear, faintly in my mind, the roar of those Harley engines. That was the moment, the calm before the storm ended. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. If Cliff wanted to play dirty, he was about to find out I'd been in dirtier games than he could ever imagine. The Monday after the bikers showed up, I decided to attend the HOA board meeting. I hadn't been to one in months, partly because I found them insufferable, partly because I was busy with my own projects. But this time I wanted to look Cliff in the eye. Not to accuse him, not yet, but to take the measure of the man who thought sending two strangers to my house to intimidate my wife was a smart idea. HOA meetings in our subdivision were held in the community clubhouse, a beige brick building with a sagging roof that the board loved to brag about managing. Inside, it always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier toner. The folding chairs were set up in neat rows, facing a long table where the board sat like magistrates. Cliff was in the middle, of course, wearing his usual HOA logo polo shirt, a clipboard in front of him like he was keeping the minutes of a Senate hearing. I slipped into the back row. The meeting dragged through the usual agenda: landscaping budgets, speed bumps, pool maintenance. Cliff loved hearing his own voice, and he puffed up every time he got to say, "As your elected president." But I wasn't listening to his words. I was watching his eyes. Every so often he'd glance my way, his mouth tightening just slightly. He knew I was there. He knew why. When the new business portion opened, I raised my hand. I'd like to ask the board a question. Cliff's eyebrows arched, but he forced a thin smile. Of course, go ahead. Does the board officially sanction residents bringing in outside parties to enforce compliance? There was a ripple of confusion in the room. A couple of neighbors turned their heads. Cliff's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he let out a chuckle. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Mr. Dalton." "I think you do," I said evenly. "Two bikers showed up at my house on Saturday. They told my wife they were friends of the board. They suggested accidents happen when people don't follow the rules." The room went quiet. Cliff's nostrils flared, but he laughed again, louder this time, like I'd told a joke. "Well, that certainly wasn't anything the board arranged. Sounds like someone's trying to stir up trouble. Maybe a misunderstanding. People like to puff themselves up. You know how it is?" I kept my eyes on him. He didn't look away, but he shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on the clipboard. That was all I needed. He wasn't surprised I was bringing it up. He was annoyed, which meant he knew exactly what I was talking about. I leaned back in my chair. "I figured I'd give you the benefit of the doubt, but if anyone else shows up at my property without invitation, there won't be a misunderstanding. There'll be a police report." I left it at that. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. I just wanted the words to sit in the air, heavy, enough for everyone in the room to feel them. And they did. The rest of the meeting blurred by. When it was over, Cliff avoided me. But two other board members and a treasurer named Linda and the secretary Mark glanced my way with something that looked a lot like unease. That night, Jenna asked me if I thought the harassment was over. I told her the truth. No. This was just their opening move. And I was right. The next 2 weeks were a campaign of irritation. We got 3 more violation notices in the mail, each more absurd than the last. One accused us of having unapproved outdoor furniture because Jenna had put a couple of rocking chairs on the porch. Another cited improper disposal of organic material because she tossed leaves into the compost bin. The most ridiculous one claimed my truck was commercial equipment and couldn't be parked in the driveway overnight, even though it was just a standard Ford F-150, cleaner and newer than half the cars in the neighborhood. Each notice came with a fine, $50 here, $100 there, chump change compared to what I could afford. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. We control you. We can make your life miserable anytime we choose. What Cliff didn't know was that I had started my own quiet investigation. I knew from experience that intimidation usually masks insecurity. The HOA wasn't sending bikers for fun. They were covering something up or trying to force me into submission before I stumbled across something they didn't want me to. See, so I started digging. Public records are a funny thing. Most people don't realize how much is out there if you just know where to look. I spent a few evenings at the county clerk's office, paging through property plats, easements, and filings. Then I combed through the HOA's annual reports, which by law they had to file, though they rarely expected anyone to read them. What I found didn't shock me, but it confirmed my suspicion. Cliff and his inner circle were playing a dirty game with the neighborhood's money. The landscaping budget was inflated, way beyond market rates. And the contractor receiving those checks was a company registered in Cliff's brother-in-law's name. Same with pool maintenance, same with clubhouse repairs. They were funneling thousands of dollars a year into sham contracts, and most residents were too busy or too trusting to notice. Now it all made sense. Cliff wasn't really worried about Jenna's little garden club. He was worried about anyone independent enough to question him. He couldn't risk losing control because control was the shield that kept his scheme hidden. And the bikers? They were just a scare tactic. A crude one, sure, but intimidation doesn't need to be clever to be effective, except in this case he'd picked the wrong target. Because once you try to scare my wife, you're not just playing with intimidation anymore. You're playing with me. And unlike Cliff, I don't play games I don't plan to win. The escalation came on a Thursday night. Jenna was making dinner when the sound of engines rolled down the street. I stepped onto the porch and saw them again, the same 2 bikers parking at the end of my driveway. They didn't come closer this time. They just sat there on their bikes, revving the engines, staring at me through their sunglasses even though the sun had already set. I stared back. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Just folded my arms across my chest and waited. After a few minutes, they turned and rode off into the dark. Jenna's hand shook when she handed me my plate that night. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. I took her hand in mine. "We're going to turn this around. Trust me." What I didn't tell her yet was that I had already set the first steps in motion. A phone call here, a quiet favor there. I wasn't alone in this. Cliff thought he was the only one with connections, but he was about to find out that I had my own network, one that didn't wear HOA polo shirts, but had a whole lot more weight when it came down to it. The board thought they were waging a war of intimidation. They hadn't realized yet that I was about to change the battlefield entirely, and soon enough, they'd come crawling back, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The third time the bikers showed up, they made the mistake of stepping onto my property. It was a Saturday morning just after 9. I was in the workshop tuning a carburetor, the smell of oil and metal steadying me the way it always does. Jenna was inside, folding laundry, humming to herself, trying to pretend like life was normal. Then I heard the sound. The low rumble of engines, closer this time, not just idling at the edge of the street, but climbing right up my driveway. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped outside. There they were again, the same two. Leather, cuts with faded patches, one tall and wiry with a gray beard, the other heavy set, tattoos crawling up his arms. They parked halfway up the drive and killed the engines, boots crunching as they dismounted. "You Dalton?" the wiry one asked, pulling off his sunglasses. His eyes were bloodshot, his grin too wide. Like he enjoyed this kind of work. I didn't answer right away. I just let the silence hang there. "Board doesn't like the way you've been talking," the heavy one added. "Said you need to learn how things work around here." That was when I noticed something. These men weren't pros. They were sloppy, the kind of guys who liked to play tough but didn't understand what real intimidation looked like. And that was a problem for Cliff, because he'd put his trust in amateurs. I stepped forward, slow and steady, closing the space between us until I could see the pulse beating in the wiry man's temple. I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. "You boys don't want to be here." The wiry one chuckled. "Oh, I think we do." "No," I said, shaking my head slightly. "You really don't. Because let me tell you how this ends. You step foot on my property again, and I don't call the HOA. I don't argue. I don't negotiate. I call the sheriff. And when the sheriff runs your plates and checks your jackets, he's going to find out real quick what kind of things you've been up to off the record. Now maybe you're fine with that, or maybe you'd rather not test me." For a second, the grin faltered. What they didn't know was that I already had their information. After their first visit, I'd spoken with an old friend from my Air Force days who now worked in law enforcement. Took just one phone call. He pulled their names, priors, associations. Nothing too dramatic. Petty assault, DUIs, a bar fight. That got out of hand, but enough that they wouldn't want the spotlight. I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. I just let them know with the tone of my voice that I had cards they didn't. The heavyset one shifted uneasily, glancing at his partner. That was when I knew I had them. "Go tell Cliff," I said, stepping back. "Tell him the game's over. If he's got a problem with me, he knows where I live. But next time you show up here, you won't be leaving without a conversation with the sheriff's department." They lingered for half a heartbeat, then swung their legs over their bikes, engines roaring to life. Gravel sprayed as they backed down my drive, and then they were gone, swallowed by the curve of the road. I stood there for a long minute, the rag still in my hand, heart steady. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened violence. I'd just shown them what real confidence looked like. But I knew Cliff, and I knew this wasn't the end. That night, I sat Jenna down at the kitchen table and laid out everything I'd uncovered about the HOA's finances. The inflated contracts, the brother-in-law landscaping deal, the sham maintenance company. She listened quietly, her brow furrowed, until I finished. "So all this, the fines, the bikers, it's just to keep us quiet?" I nodded. "He knows if we start asking questions, others will too. And if the neighborhood finds out he's been bleeding them for years, his little empire collapses." Her eyes hardened. I'd seen that look before, back when life had thrown us harder tests. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was angry. And when Jenna gets angry, she doesn't back down. "Then let's bring him down," she said simply. I smiled, slow and deliberate. That's the plan. The next few days were about strategy. I called in another favor, this time from a buddy who worked as an independent auditor. Together, we combed through the HOA's last 3 years of filings. The pattern was clear. Inflated invoices, duplicate charges, maintenance projects that were never actually completed but paid out anyway. It was theft, plain and simple, hidden under the guise of association management. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on the bikers. They didn't come back to the house, but I saw them once at the gas station down the road, talking in low tones, their body language tighter than before. Whatever Cliff had promised them, it wasn't worth the heat they were starting to feel. And that was the key to my counterstrike. I didn't have to fight them directly. All I had to do was turn the pressure back on Cliff until his own pawn started questioning whether the game was worth playing. So I prepared my move. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I arrived early, binder in hand, and sat in the front row this time. Cliff looked surprised to see me, though he masked it with that fake politician's smile. When new business opened, I stood up. "I'd like to address the board," I said. "Of course," Cliff replied, smoothly. "Always happy to hear from residents." I set the binder on the table and flipped it open, revealing copies of the HOA's financial records, highlighted, tabbed, organized. "I've been reviewing the association's expenditures, and I've got some questions. For instance, why did the HOA pay $24,000 last year for pool repairs that never happened? Why is the landscaping budget almost double the county average? And why is the contractor's business registered to your brother-in-law? And why are residents being fined for trivial violations while the board funnels money into phantom companies?" The room went silent. Cliff's face drained of color. "This isn't a theory," I continued, tapping the binder. "This is documentation. I've already had it reviewed by an independent auditor. If the board can't explain these discrepancies tonight, I'll be forwarding this packet to the County Fraud Division first thing tomorrow." The treasurer, Linda, looked like she might faint. Mark, the secretary, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at the other residents, who were now whispering among themselves. Cliff opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. I closed the binder. "That's all I've got." Then I sat back down. The meeting limped on after that, but the energy had shifted. The whispers grew louder. People were no longer nodding obediently at Cliff's words. They were questioning, doubting, and doubt, once it spreads, is unstoppable. That night, Jenna squeezed my hand as we walked back to the truck. "You think it's enough?" she asked. I looked back at the clubhouse where Cliff was still inside, arguing with the treasurer. "It's enough to crack him," I said, "and once the cracks show, the rest will crumble. But here's the thing about men like Cliff. When cornered, they don't surrender quietly. They lash out. And I knew, deep down, that his next move would be desperate. What I didn't know, not yet, was that desperation was about to drive him to the edge, and when that happened, the bikers, who thought they were the predators, would be the ones crawling back to me, begging for it all to stop. The night before the storm broke, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the danger was gone, far from it, but because I could feel the shift. Cliff was unraveling. His polished arrogance at the HOA meetings was slipping. The neighbors were whispering. The bikers, once so eager to puff their chests in my driveway, now lingered at the edge of the subdivision like men unsure of their orders. Pressure does that to people. It exposes the cracks, and once the cracks start showing, the collapse is inevitable. It was a Thursday evening when the knock came. Not the heavy pounding I'd braced for, not the roar of engines outside, but a hesitant, almost embarrassed knock on the door. I opened it to find the two bikers, the wiry one and the heavy-set one, standing on my porch without their sunglasses, without their grins. Their bikes idled at the curb, but the bravado was gone. "Dalton," the wiry one said, shifting from foot to foot. His voice was rough, but there was no swagger in it. We need to talk." Behind me, Jenna stiffened. I gave her a reassuring glance and stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What is it?" I asked, folding my arms. They exchanged a glance, like neither wanted to be the one to speak. Finally, the heavy-set one cleared his throat. "Look, we didn't sign up for all this. Cliff, he said it was just some scare stuff. You know, spook the wife, put pressure on you. Easy money. But now the sheriff's been sniffing around. People are talking and, well, we don't want to be part of it anymore." I let the silence stretch, watched them squirm. "So," I said finally, "you're here to tell me you're done?" "Yeah," the wiry one said quickly. Done. No more visits, no more threats. We just want out. Cliff's losing it. He's calling us every day, saying you're about to ruin everything. We didn't sign up for heat like this. There it was. The shift. The predators turned supplicants. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so they had to lean in to hear me. You tell Cliff this. The more he digs, the deeper the hole gets. I've got the records. I've got the neighbors. And if he pushes me 1 inch further, I'll have the county fraud division. He's finished. You got me? They both nodded, eager now, like kids trying to escape detention. And one more thing, I added. If either of you ever sets foot on my property again, you won't have to worry about Cliff or me. You'll be dealing directly with the sheriff. Understood? Understood, the heavy one muttered. They shuffled back to their bikes, fired, up the engines, and rode off into the night. Not roaring, not menacing, just leaving. Like men who'd finally realized they'd been on the wrong side of the line. The very next morning, the board's world collapsed. Linda, the treasurer, resigned in a public email to the entire subdivision. She admitted she'd been pressured into signing off on inflated invoices and no-show contracts, and she wasn't willing to go down with Cliff. Within hours, the neighborhood Facebook page lit up. Residents demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding Cliff's head. By evening, a petition was circulating to remove him as president. I didn't start it, but I didn't need to. Once the truth leaked, the neighborhood didn't need my voice anymore. They had their own. Cliff tried to hold one last emergency meeting that weekend, but it was chaos. Dozens of residents showed up, waving copies of the financial documents I'd slipped to them. People shouted, demanded to know why their dues had been lining his brother-in-law's pockets instead of fixing the pool or repaving the roads. Cliff tried to shout back, tried to bluff, but the authority he once wielded like a weapon had crumbled to dust. And I just sat in the front row with Jenna, silent, watching it all burn down. It ended the way these things always do, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Cliff resigned for personal reasons the following week, though everyone knew the truth. The County Fraud Division opened an investigation, and while I can't say what happened behind closed doors, I do know his brother-in-law's landscaping company vanished overnight. As for the bikers, I never saw them again. Word around town was they'd packed up and left, chasing work somewhere else. Maybe they found another fool to hire them. Maybe they learned a little humility. Either way, they were out of my life, and that was enough. One evening. Not long after it all ended, Jenna and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low behind the trees. She leaned her head on my shoulder, the garden she'd fought so hard for blooming at the edge of the yard. "You think it's really over?" she asked softly. I squeezed her hand. "For us, yeah. For Cliff, not so much. He's got a lot of explaining to do to people with badges." She laughed, the tension finally gone from her voice. And in that moment, the peace we'd chosen this place for came back. The crickets sang, the air was clean, and the neighborhood, our neighborhood, was finally free from the petty tyrant, who'd tried to rule it with fear. If there's one thing I've learned in life, it's this. Bullies thrive on silence. They count on you to look away, to ignore the little abuses until they grow into big ones. But the moment you stand up, calmly, firmly, without blinking, you strip them of their power. The HOA thought they could intimidate us. They thought bikers and fines and fear would keep us in line. But in the end, all they did was expose themselves. And when the bullies finally came crawling back, begging me to stop, it wasn't because I'd shouted louder. It was because I'd never been afraid to begin with. And that, I realized, was the one thing they could never take from us.